Social realities and hierarchies. In Indian higher education, the intersection of caste, class, and gender significantly influences how students express themselves, engage with peers, and navigate academic structures. Intersectionality, a concept rooted in the critical feminist theory of Crenshaw, provides a review that situates student language in higher education within a multicultural and multilingual concept. The research questions. First, how do caste, class, and gender identities intersect to shape the language practices of students in higher education? The second research question is, in what ways does student language reflects social hierarchies and power relations within the multicultural university settings? The third research question, how do informal linguistic practices such as slang, humor, and digital communication serves as tool for identity negotiation across caste, class, and gender lines? Fourth research question, what role does intersectionality plays in determining access to participation, recognition, and belonging in the higher education institution? And the fifth research question is, how can an intersectional lens contribute to creating inclusive educational policies and pedagogical strategies in multilingual and multicultural contexts? The research objectives are, first, to critically review existing research on the intersection of caste, class, and gender identity in shaping student language in higher education, to examine how formal and informal modes of communication reflect structural inequalities and cultural negotiations, to explore how multilingual and multicultural contexts influence students' linguistic practices through an intersectional perspective, to analyze the implications of intersectional student language practices for educational inclusion, pedagogy, and institutional culture. And the last one, to identify gaps in the literature and suggest directions for future research at the intersection of sociolinguistics, education, and cultural studies. The methodology which I have followed is this review paper adopts a qualitative narrative review methodology. A wide range of peer-reviewed journals, articles, books, and reports from the disciplines including sociolinguistics, education, gender studies, cultural studies were consulted. Sources were identified using academic databases such as Google Scholar, Juster, Scopus, UGC Care journals, and only peer-reviewed and indexed works were included to ensure the reliability. Now the theoretical frameworks which guide this study. The first one is intersectionality theory, given by Crenshaw. It provides the central analytical tool for understanding how multiple identities intersect to produce unique linguistic and educational experiences. Next is sociolinguistic theories of language and identity. It offers insight into how language constructs and reflects social identities, including marginalized voices. The next one is critical pedagogy, which is very famous in education sector. It highlights how power relations manifest in classroom communication and how language can be used to challenge domination and promote empowerment. The next one is social reproduction theory, given by Bourdieu. It emphasizes how linguistic capital is unequally distributed along the lines of caste, class, gender, reproducing the educational inequalities. And the last one is queer linguistics and feminist linguistics. It provides tools for examining how gender and sexuality are negotiated through language intersecting with caste, class identities in higher education. Okay, so talking about the intersectionality and student language. Intersectionality, a concept first articulated by Kimberly Crenshaw, emphasizes how identities such as race, gender, class, and caste interlock to create complex system of advantage and disadvantage. In the context of higher education, student language provides a unique entry point to the study of these intersections. Language is both a medium of knowledge exchange and a reflection of deeply rooted social hierarchies. For instance, caste-based honorifics and class-related accents often signal implicit hierarchies in university spaces. Now, talking about caste, language, and hierarchies in higher education. So caste continues to be a determining factor in shaping linguistic practices in Indian higher education. Studies reveal that students from marginalized caste often face linguistic discrimination, whether through mockery of dialects or in exclusion from elite English-speaking circles. English in particular is tied to cultural capital and mobility, while the vernacular languages are often stigmatized. This reproduces caste hierarchies in subtle linguistic forms. Talking about class, accent, and the politics of English. So, class plays a central role in shaping linguistic privilege in universities. Access to the elite schooling often determines fluency in English, which functions as the language of prestige and Indian higher education. Students from rural or working class backgrounds frequently encounter ridicule for their accents and grammatical structures. Such linguistic hierarchies affect not only academic performance but also social mobility, peer acceptance, and participation in co-curricular activities. Like Tarun earlier, he talked about the slangs. So the students who come from Bhojpuri background, they talk in English or Hindi, but meanwhile they use a word athua. हम अथुआ ये बोलना चाह रहे थे. So people just ridicule, क्या अथुआ अथुआ करते हो, क्या है अथुआ? So like that things comes. Now talking about gendered dimensions of student speech. Gender shapes how students use and are judged for their language practices. Female students, for example, are often subject to greater scrutiny regarding politeness, tone, appropriateness of slang. In mixed genders interaction, men may dominate the conversation while women's contributions are interrupted and dismissed. Studies in higher education also show that women using assertive or masculine coded speech are labeled negatively, while queer students often create their own new ways of speaking by mixing words, slangs, and styles so that they can freely show their identities that do not fit into the fixed level of male, female, or straight. For example, they mix Hindi and English in playful ways, like saying, "Yeah, I'm feeling full on dramatic today, totally extra," where extra is queer slang for being over the top. This demonstrates how gender intersects with caste and class, producing layered inequalities in speech norms. Now talking about multilingual campuses and code switching. Elite students often switch seamlessly between English and regional languages, while the marginalized students may be excluded if they lack fluency in the dominant registers. Code switching also has a gendered and caste-based dimension. For example, women may switch to English in formal classroom spaces to be taken seriously or gain respect, but when they return to the local and vernacular languages with friends for comfort and belonging. Talking about informal speech and digital communication. In today's digital era, platforms such as WhatsApp, Instagram, Telegram provide semi-private spaces where informal registers dominate student exchanges. Dalit and feminist student collectives have used digital spaces to coin counter discourses, often blending humor with political critique. Like Dalit students collectives sometimes post the memes that joke about English elitism in the universities. For example, a meme showing a professor praising fluent English speakers is captioned as "merit equals to English accent." Similarly, this uses humor to critique caste and class privilege, whereas feminist groups often create satirical hashtags like hashtag girls hostel curfew with funny posts comparing hostel rules for boys and girls, where the boys hostel is equal to 24/7 cafe, whereas the girls hostel is jail after 8 p.m. So this humor highlights gender discrimination in campus policies. Also, there are protest language and student movements. Protest language has long been central to the student movements in India and worldwide. Now, talking about humor, sarcasm, and power dynamics. Humor and sarcasm in student language are not merely playful tools; they are deeply implicated in power relations. Upper caste and elite class students may also use humor to stereotype and exclude marginalized peers. Talking about queer linguistics practices in higher education. So, queer students develop unique linguistic practices that destabilize the normative binaries of gender and sexuality. These practices include playful reappropriations of slurs, hybrid linguistic codes, and the use of global queer lexicons adapted in the local context, like playful reappropriation of the slurs, a word that was once used as an insult, that is chhakka, a derogatory term for effeminate men, is sometimes reclaimed by the queer students themselves humorously and proudly to take away its sting. Like a queer student might jokingly say to a close friend group, "Arey yaar, aaj to full chhakka vibes," using the slur in a way that shows confidence instead of shame. Similarly, in hybrid linguistic codes, they mix Hindi and English in queer styles. For example, she is giving a totally Devi vibes like goddess plus drama queen combo. Here, Devi Hindi is blended with English queer slang, that is drama queen. Similarly, use of global queer lexicons in local context. Words like slay, fabulous, shade, or queen, they come from global queer culture, largely English or Western, but are adapted into Indian contexts. For example, a queer student complimenting a friend after a presentation might say, "Arey yaar, tu to aaj full slay kar diya," mixing the English with global queer slang. In Indian campuses, queer collectives often use performative speech, poetry, and digital storytelling to assert visibility. Now, talking about comparative global perspectives, studies from the United States, South Africa, Europe demonstrate how race, class, and gender intersect in campus communication to reproduce inequalities. African American vernacular English in US schools, for example, has been stigmatized, similarly to how Dalit dialects are marginalized in India. Now, talking about discussion, the reviewed literature demonstrate that student language in higher education is critical site for understanding the intersections of caste, class, and gender. The findings suggest that linguistic practices are not only reflective of existing inequalities, but also actively contribute to their reproduction and contestants. Okay. Gender norms further complicate this landscape as women and queer students experience unique pressures and innovations in linguistic performance. There were also some limitations of this study. While the review synthesizes a wide range of research, certain limitations must be acknowledged. The first one, the majority of the studies examined are qualitative and context specific, which limits the generalizability across all higher education settings. The second one, there remains a relative scarcity of empirical research that simultaneously examines the caste, class, and gender in relation to the student language. Talking about the conclusion, through the intersectional lens, it is evident that language functions as a site of power, identity, and belonging. Caste-based exclusion, like class-related linguistic privilege and gender expectation, converge to influence how students participate in academic and social life. The review highlights the importance of addressing linguistic inequalities within higher education policy and pedagogy, recognizing that inclusive language practices are vital to achieving equitable educational outcomes. Now, lastly, the suggestions from my side. Higher education institutions should adopt inclusive language policies that recognize and validate multiple linguistic identities, moving beyond just English-centric norms. Teacher training programs should incorporate awareness of caste, class, and gender dynamics in student communication, equipping the educators to create inclusive classroom. Universities should encourage multilingual pedagogical practices, including translanguaging, to reduce the linguistic exclusion. Student support system must be strengthened to address linguistic discrimination, particularly for Dalit, working class women, and queer students. More research should be conducted on intersectional language practices in higher education, especially empirical studies that combine caste, class, and gender dimensions. Two more suggestions. Digital platforms within universities should be monitored for inclusivity, ensuring that online spaces empower rather than marginalize students. Curricula should include works from marginalized voices such as Dalit literature and feminist texts to reflect diverse linguistic identities. So this was from my side, and many more things are there in my paper that you will get when they will publish the ISBN edited book. Thank you so much.